What if everything you believe about Jesus' death is a lie? Get ready, because what you will discover now may shake all your beliefs about faith, the Bible, and the deepest secrets of the Church. A forbidden gospel, yes, prohibited, states that Jesus didn't die on the cross, and that the entire narrative of the crucifixion may have been altered, manipulated, or worse, manufactured. But why was this text hidden for centuries? And why does the Vatican, do you insist on keeping absolute silence about him? What you are about to hear involves secret texts, censored documents, and one of the greatest mysteries ever buried in archives of the Vatican's secret library. For centuries, religious leaders have kept under lock and key information that could rewrite the history of Christianity. Information that, if revealed to the world, could cause a profound rupture in the faith of millions of people. We are talking about apocryphal gospels, taken from official teachings, branded as heresy, hidden in dark chambers, in underground vaults within the walls of the Vatican. The reason? Simple. They directly challenge the accepted version of Jesus' death and resurrection. But now, with fragments of that manuscript resurfacing and independent scholars trying to break the Church's age-old silence, new light is being shed on what the Vatican doesn't want you to discover. Why does the Vatican hide this gospel? What is the true content of this forbidden text? And most importantly, what does this mean for your faith, for your story, for the world as we know it? In this video, we dive behind the scenes of this ancient conspiracy, analyzing evidence, reports, and shocking details that may reveal the hidden truth behind the crucifixion. We will show why so many scholars are convinced that there is something much bigger being hidden in the Vatican's secret archives. But before we reveal the shocking content of this forbidden gospel, you need to understand the dark context behind its censorship. And that's exactly what you'll discover now. But first, I want to make a special request of you. If you feel in your heart that something is being hidden, if this revelation touched you in any way, write your prayer request here in the comments. Yes, it may seem simple, but this is powerful. This channel is not just a space to reveal the Vatican secrets or expose the forbidden gospels. It is also a place of welcome, of faith, and of people like you who seek spiritual truth above religious lies. We will pray together. And it doesn't matter if your request is for answers, for spiritual liberation, for healing, or for direction. We will pray for you. Because right now, while many still sleep in illusion, you are seeking the truth. And this is the beginning of a transformation. And if this content is opening your eyes, if you believe that more people need access to this truth, leave your like right now. This shows YouTube that this video is important. Furthermore, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any future revelations. We're just getting started. There are still many censored texts, secret documents, and mysteries buried in the Vatican catacombs that need to come to light. And now that you understand the gravity of what lies behind this hidden gospel, get ready to delve into something even deeper. The real content of the manuscript that claims that Jesus didn't die on the cross. And what he says will change everything. Many texts were ignored or banned, but among them, one in particular stands out. And it's not just any text. We are talking about a gospel that has been deliberately removed, silenced, buried in the confines of history. A manuscript that carries a revelation so controversial, so explosive, that it could shake the very fabric of Christianity as we know it. Just imagine, an ancient text, preserved in secret for centuries, hidden among the archives of the Vatican's secret library, which claims that Jesus did not die on the cross, that everything that has been told, from pulpits to biblical films, may be incomplete, manipulated, or even completely distorted. This gospel, considered by many scholars as the Gospel of Barnabas, or in other variations as a secret fragment associated with the Gnostic texts, directly challenges the canonical Gospels. He narrates a completely different version of the crucifixion. According to this account, at the time of Jesus' arrest, divine intervention would have occurred, and the one who was taken to the cross was not Jesus, but someone else. Some say it was Judas Iscariot, miraculously transformed into one similar to him, so that the prophecy would be fulfilled in a symbolic and not literal way. But why would this be hidden? Why did this text never reach the common believers? Why isn't it in the Bibles you find in churches? Because it doesn't confirm the official narrative. Because it raises profound questions about the identity of Christ, about the true meaning of salvation, about the role of the Church throughout history, especially the role of the Vatican in selecting what should or should not be known. This is precisely why the Vatican hides, omits, and denies these apocryphal Gospels with so much effort. These texts threaten control of the narrative. They challenge established authority. And in a world where the power of faith influences politics, culture, and even wars, controlling the narrative is controlling the people. Many of these documents were found in archaeological excavations in the Middle East, others in underground chambers of ancient monasteries. Some were sold on the black market, taken to private libraries, and disappeared from public hands. And even so, independent scholars and researchers managed to access excerpts in Aramaic, in Greek, in Syriac, and translated in detail the content that these manuscripts reveal. The descriptions are rich, impactful, and, above all, disconcerting. They present a Jesus who is deeply human, wise, connected to the divine, but not crucified, a Messiah whose mission was spiritual, not sacrificial, and who would never have been handed over to die on a cross. This information directly challenges the doctrine of redemption by blood, which is one of the most central pillars of the traditional Christian faith. And here, you begin to understand the reason for the fear. Why the silence? Because if this truth comes to light, in a broad way, it could provoke a global faith crisis. It can make millions of people question everything they believe, everything they have lived, everything they have built religiously. And that's why this content is so dangerously kept confidential. Because he breaks the chains of imposed faith and frees those who are willing to face the truth, even if it is uncomfortable. But there is something even more surprising. Some theologians claim that certain excerpts from the Bible itself indicate this possibility that Jesus did not die the way we were told. Small details in canonical texts, which, when read in light of the apocryphal Gospels, become hidden clues to a hidden reality. It is as if the authors themselves left fragments for those who are able to see beyond. And this deeper reading is becoming increasingly accessible thanks to the work of independent scholars who are not tied to the institutional shackles of the Vatican. You may be asking yourself, but if this is all true, why hasn't anyone talked about this before? The answer is simple. Many have tried, but they were silenced, persecuted, discredited. Priests who dared to question the dogmas were expelled. Researchers lost their funding. Manuscripts were confiscated and disappeared. Even today, there are reports of Vatican pressure about universities and religious institutions so that certain topics are never debated in public. No wonder this gospel is called prohibited. It is not just prohibited in the physical sense. It is prohibited ideologically. It is a threat to the spiritual power structure that has dominated the world for millennia. And yet, here we are, talking about him, revealing what many don't want you to hear. But you need to listen, because you deserve the truth. You deserve to know the whole story. You deserve the right to decide what you believe, without hiding facts from you. What is written in this gospel is not a simple theological divergence. It is a revelation that can change the way you see your faith, your spirituality, your connection with the divine. Therefore, I want you to stay with me until the end of this video, because we are going to dive deeper into this forbidden text, show translated excerpts, historical evidence, and compare all of this with what the Church officially preaches. You will understand how the contents of this manuscript can rewrite not only the events of the crucifixion, but Jesus' entire journey on earth. And if you've come this far, it's because you feel something is wrong, something was hidden, and now it's starting to be revealed. At the end of this video, I want you to leave a comment with the phrase, "The truth will set me free." This will show that you are part of this awakening. Or write, "I want the complete truth," if this content is really touching you. Also, leave your prayer request. We are forming a community that seeks, that questions, that connects spiritually even in the face of the densest shadows of institutionalized religion. Let's continue. because what comes next may be even more disturbing. In this text, there is a bombastic revelation. Jesus did not die on the cross. It was someone else in his place. And this is not a symbolic interpretation or a spiritual allegory. This apocryphal gospel, hidden in the cold corridors of the Vatican's secret library, clearly describes an exchange of identities that was designed to confuse Jesus' enemies and preserve his spiritual mission. According to the manuscript, during the arrest, another man, identified by some as Judas Iscariot, by others as Simon of Cyrene, would have been supernaturally transformed or confused to take Jesus' place before the Roman authorities. Meanwhile, the true Messiah would have been secretly removed and protected until his ascension. This theory is not new, but the way the text describes the details is what makes it so dangerous to the pillars of traditional Christian doctrine. The narrative of the sacrifice on the cross is the center of faith for billions of people. Questioning this part is like removing the cornerstone of an ancient temple, and that is why this gospel was banned, labeled heresy, and cast into the shadows. He not only presents a different version of Christ's passion, he exposes an entire structure of control and censorship imposed over the centuries by those who dominate spiritual knowledge. And the burning question is, why doesn't the Vatican allow the faithful to have access to these texts? Why such resistance in recognizing that there are other versions of the facts, written by people close to us, in times so close to the events? Many of these writings were found in regions that preserved Christian traditions parallel to Roman Catholicism. Codices hidden in the desert, buried by persecuted Gnostic communities, wrapped in linen cloths and sealed with wax seals as if they were guarding the last breath of a forbidden truth. The language used in these Gospels is fascinating. They do not deny Jesus' divinity, but present a lofty view of his mission. He did not come into the world to die, but to teach a secret path of spiritual liberation, something that has been corrupted and adapted over the centuries, to create a system of worship based on fear, guilt, and suffering. What if this version is the true one? What if the true purpose of Jesus was purposely diverted to keep people trapped in a rigid, controlling religious structure? The content of these texts is full of spiritual mysteries, codes that are only now being deciphered thanks to advances in technology and the courage of independent researchers. Many of these scholars have been discredited, their work boycotted at conferences, their discoveries dismissed because they do not align with the official narrative. But still, the truth begins to seep through the cracks in the system. Fragments of the original manuscripts were digitized and compared with other ancient sources. Entire excerpts are already circulating in academic communities, and it is a matter of time before everything comes to light. What is impressive is how, even after so many centuries, the Vatican still maintains a firm position in denying any spiritual value to these texts. It is as if admitting the existence of another version was the beginning of the end for the religious control that was built on dogmas. Internal documents that were leaked by former Vatican officials indicate that there are at least 20 unpublished Gospels in the Church's possession, locked in code-protected rooms, watched over by Vatican gendarmerie guards. Access is restricted to selected scholars, under direct supervision, and any public mention of these contents may result in excommunication. But the question we need to ask ourselves is, what is so dangerous about these texts? What is actually written on them that justifies this level of protection, silence, and concealment? What is the Vatican so afraid of the world discovering? The answers, although fragmented, begin to emerge between the lines of the apocryphal reports. They describe a Jesus who knew powerful spiritual truths, who spoke of the power of consciousness, of inner light, of direct connection with the divine, no need for temples, priests, or rituals. A Jesus who liberated, who awakened, who showed people that the kingdom of God is within each one, and that the cross, contrary to what we were taught, was not the end point of his journey, but a farce created to consolidate a hierarchical and obedient system of faith. These words, when read carefully, do not deny the importance of Jesus. On the contrary, they magnify him. But not in the way the Church would like. They take control out of the hands of institutions and return power to the individual. And this, for a structure like the Vatican, is too dangerous. Imagine what the impact would be if this information were widely disseminated. Imagine how many people would rethink their beliefs, their religious practices, their way of connecting with God. The world could experience a new spiritual awakening, not based on fear or submission, but on knowledge, freedom, and light. And perhaps that is why, even after so many centuries, the Vatican continues to invest in strategies to stifle this truth. But that's what we're here for, to unearth the secrets, to open the hidden archives, to reveal the forbidden books, and give voice to what has been silenced. We are breaking the veil of censorship and turning the eyes of the world on what they tried to hide with all their might. The text states that Jesus was taken to heaven and Judas took his place at crucifixion. Yes, exactly that. For many, this statement sounds like heresy, like something that defies centuries of Christian tradition. But for those who carefully study the apocryphal Gospels, especially those suppressed and ignored by the Church, this idea represents a fundamental piece of a larger puzzle, a hidden truth, that has been carefully covered up by religious leaders since the first councils, such as that of Nicaea, where political decisions were disguised as divine revelations. According to this forbidden gospel, the moment Jesus was surrounded by Roman soldiers, divine intervention occurred, not as a miracle visible to the eyes of the world, but as a silent, hidden act, carefully planned by the divine to protect the one who carried a spiritual mission misunderstood until today. This document describes that Jesus, at the last moment, was spiritually elevated, taken to heaven before suffering any torture or physical death. Judas, the one who had betrayed him, would have been transformed into the likeness of Jesus, deceiving the soldiers and everyone around, being crucified in his place. A fair punishment, a divine irony, or part of an even deeper plan to test humanity. Scholars do not reach a consensus. The Vatican, in turn, prefers to ignore this possibility, erase it from history, pretend that such texts never existed, but the records are there. In the caves of Nag Hammadi, in Coptic manuscripts, in documents found in Armenian and Ethiopian archives, versions of this same account are repeated with small variations, but maintaining the same core. Jesus was not crucified. What we saw was an illusion, an exchange, a divine act to protect the one who did not need to die, because his mission was different. And the most disturbing thing about all this is that, in some passages of these texts, Jesus would have warned his disciples that the world would be deceived, that his image would be used, his name distorted, his teachings corrupted to build something very different from what he actually taught. The message of spiritual liberation, of direct connection with the divine, of breaking with the structures of the temple and institutionalized religion, all of this would have been replaced by a narrative of suffering, guilt, and submission. The symbol of the cross, which in prohibited texts represents deception and punishment, was transformed into an icon of faith. An instrument of torture became a sacred object. And Jesus, the one who, according to the apocryphal Gospels, was never touched by nails or crowns of thorns, became the central martyr of a story that perhaps never happened the way we were told. If you are feeling discomfort, doubts, or even indignation, this is natural. These revelations are not easy to process. The mind fights against everything it has been taught, against the dogmas repeated since childhood. But this is precisely why it is important to move forward, because there is much more hidden. We are not just talking about a theory or an alternative view of the crucifixion. We are talking about real documents, preserved in ancient languages, which were translated and analyzed by respected experts, even though they were boycotted by major academic and religious centers. Many of these scholars, in bringing this information to light, have had their careers destroyed, their names tarnished, their families threatened. Does this seem exaggerated to you? Be aware that, to this day, the simple possession of certain manuscripts is considered a crime in some countries with a strong presence of the Church, and many documents were purchased at silent auctions, acquired by Vatican emissaries, with the sole aim of hiding them for good. And even so, some fragments escaped. They were digitized, secretly shared by courageous researchers, and today they circulate in private communities, in closed forums, in circles that refuse to accept a faith shaped by fear. These texts speak of a Jesus who walked among men as a teacher, not as a sacrifice, who taught about inner light, about spiritual rebirth, about true eternal life, not as reward or punishment, but as a state of consciousness. And they point to Judas not just as a traitor, but as someone who played a decisive role in fulfilling a hidden plan. Some of these writings even say that Judas was instructed by Jesus himself, who knew what was coming and used betrayal as a key to activate something greater. That changes everything, doesn't it? It changes the way we see the crucifixion. The role of the disciples changes. It changes what we believe about redemption. It changes the meaning of death and resurrection, change the logic of sin. And that is exactly why this text is so dangerous. Because it gives the believer back the ability to think. Because it forces us to confront our beliefs, to look at faith as something dynamic, in constant discovery. Because he shows that perhaps everything we have been taught thus far has been part of a carefully edited narrative, shaped to serve not the spirit, but the power. And when we start to make these connections, to understand the interests behind the silence, everything starts to make sense. The Church's effort to maintain control over texts, the insistence on declaring as heresy everything that escapes the official canon, the rituals that reinforce guilt instead of spiritual freedom. All of this is interconnected. And now, with access to information that has been hidden for a long time, we have the chance to reconstruct this story, to rewrite the trajectory of the Messiah based on what has been stifled for millennia. The opportunity to look at Jesus not as a dead martyr, but as a living teacher, not as a symbol of pain, but as a guide to awakening. If you feel like this is stirring something inside you, if these words have raised questions, then right here in the comments, I want to see what they hid. Or if you're ready to go deeper, say, show upcoming banned texts. Also, leave your prayer request. We are bringing together people who want more than an appearance of faith. They want depth, truth, light, and the journey is just beginning. Because in the next section of this forbidden gospel, we will discover something that may be even more revealing. This version completely contradicts the pillars of traditional Christianity. And we are not talking about a small doctrinal variation or a simple difference in interpretation between the Gospels. We are talking about a radical break with what has been taught for centuries in pulpits, churches, cathedrals, and councils. The idea that Jesus did not die on the cross but was taken up to heaven while another was crucified in his place, as recounted in this forbidden gospel, dismantles the theological foundation upon which institutional Christianity was built. The atoning sacrifice, the cross, the blood, redemption, the literal resurrection of the body, all of this comes into question. Because if Jesus didn't die the way we were told, then why would he need to be physically resurrected? If there was no death on the cross, there is no body buried. And if there is no tomb, the entire theology of carnal resurrection needs to be reinterpreted. This revelation not only rewrites the crucifixion narrative, it demands a complete revision of the meaning of the Christian faith as it has been propagated since the 4th century. It was during this period, after the officialization of Christianity as the religion of the Roman Empire, that councils began to shape what was and was not acceptable. It was at these meetings, such as the Council of Nicaea, that texts like this were declared heretical, excluded from the Bible, banned from public reading, and destroyed whenever found. Only copies protected by Gnostic communities, hidden in caves or buried as spiritual treasures, managed to escape total destruction. The Vatican, as the official guardian of Christian doctrine, was responsible for maintaining this editorial control, hiding any material that threatened the central narrative of the cross, death, and resurrection. And that is precisely why these apocryphal texts, especially those that bring an alternative version of Christ's passion, are considered so dangerous. Not only do they threaten the institutional structure of the Church, they place power back in the hands of the individual. After all, if salvation does not depend on a literal sacrifice, but rather on a spiritual and direct understanding with the divine, then what is the role of the Church? What is the function of rituals, confessions, penances? If Jesus did not die on the cross but ascended to heaven with full consciousness, leaving Judas as the unconscious substitute for crucifixion, then the cross transforms from a symbol, of redemption to a symbol of illusion, a sham that served interests far greater than spirituality. This forbidden gospel presents a Jesus much closer to the Gnostic figure, enlightened, conscious, bearer of secret knowledge, the true Logos, that was distorted over time. He does not preach suffering as a path of faith. He teaches spiritual awakening, liberation from the bonds of matter, the rediscovery of the divine spark that exists within each person. And that changes everything, because by taking the focus off the physical sacrifice, this version rescues what may have been Jesus' real teaching, self-knowledge as the key to salvation, and not blind submission to dogmas imposed by men in the name of God. The Church, of course, has always been aware of these writings. The Vatican's secret archives, stretching miles underground, hold not only historical records and papal correspondence, but also priceless theological documents. Ancient manuscripts, unpublished translations, entire versions of Gospels erased from official history are there, locked away, inaccessible to the public. Many of these documents have already been catalogued by scholars who, after working in secrecy for years, revealed the existence of texts that directly contradict the Synoptic Gospels. There are reports of scholars who saw these scrolls with their own eyes, but were prohibited from copying, translating, or disseminating them under threat of retaliation. And you may be wondering, why would the Vatican try so hard to hide this? The reason is simple and brutally logical. Control. Control of the narrative. Control of faith. Mind control. The power of the Church, for centuries, was tied to the idea that it held the absolute truth, and that any questioning would be a direct attack on faith. But true faith is not afraid of questions. True faith invites you to search, to dive deep, to confront the unknown. And if these apocryphal texts reveal a different truth, then perhaps it is time to reevaluate everything that has been considered unquestionable. Some copies of this gospel were translated and circulate today in rare versions, often discredited by traditional media. But just read carefully to feel the power of what is there. Jesus does not appear as a victim, but as a master, not as a sacrificial lamb, but as a conductor of a divine plan that transcends material understanding. Judas, in turn, is portrayed not only as a traitor, but as a piece of a spiritual enigma. In certain sections, he doesn't even seem to be fully aware of what is about to happen, as if he were being guided by invisible forces, part of a larger cosmic game. And when he is crucified, mistaken for Jesus, the whole world believes they are witnessing the end of the Messiah, when in fact, the true master was already far away, safe, waiting for the right moment to reveal himself again. The symbolism of this is powerful. The idea that the world was deceived, that the cross was an illusory spectacle, that the real event took place behind the scenes of history, away from the eyes of the masses, is a profound spiritual provocation, and it forces us to reflect. How many other truths have been disguised to become palatable? How many times has history been rewritten to fit the mold of what the Church wanted us to believe? Researchers have found copies of this gospel in secret monasteries and ancient archives. We're not talking here about speculation or stories made up by conspiracy enthusiasts. We're talking about real historical records, documented, analyzed, and studiously ignored by traditional religious institutions. These copies did not appear out of nowhere, nor did they come to light by chance. They were hidden. They were kept for centuries, often protected by monks who knew their value and the risk they would run if these contents fell into the wrong hands. Monasteries in the Middle East, North Africa, Turkey, Egypt, and even Ethiopia housed versions of these. Manuscripts considered cursed by the official church. Some of them were sealed with Aramaic symbols. Others were in scrolls wrapped in cloth, placed in clay urns and buried beneath stone altars, as if what was there was a sacred treasure. And, in a way, it was. These texts have survived the passage of time, the destruction caused by inquisitors, the wars that destroyed entire libraries. The simple fact that they resisted is a miracle in itself. And now, finally, they are beginning to be translated, analyzed, and, little by little, revealed to the world, even if many try to discredit or silence them once again. The most recent discovery happened in an ancient Maronite monastery in Lebanon. During a restoration of the crypt, archaeologists found a hidden compartment, sealed with a marble slab and covered in ancient symbols. Inside, there was a wooden safe lined with lead, where 4 manuscripts were kept. One of them, in Syriac, contained a narrative that not only confirmed the Yao theory that Jesus did not die on the cross, but also detailed the operation that had been carried out to hide his true destiny. According to the text, Jesus already knew about the plan in advance and would have instructed a select group of disciples about what would happen, including the role of Judas. The most impressive thing is that the accounts of this gospel are not isolated. Similar fragments have been found at Qumran, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and in Gnostic texts from Egypt. In a Coptic document that became known as the Gospel of Enlightenment, there are almost identical passages that describe the crucifixion as a deception, a scene played out before the eyes of the people, while Jesus, in an elevated spirit, watched everything from afar. These coincidences between texts discovered in geographically distant locations and with different cultures indicate something that goes far beyond inventions. These are traces of a hidden, stifled, but never completely erased tradition. Some independent scholars have risked their reputations to translate and publish these excerpts, even though they know they will face fierce criticism from traditional academia and the church. But the truth has a strength that surpasses fear, and what you read in these texts is captivating. They speak of a Jesus deeply aware of his mission, not as a lamb given to the slaughter, but as a messenger of inner liberation. He spoke of the divine spark within each of us, of the possibility of redemption through truth, not suffering. And above all, he warned about false teachers and those who would distort his words to control entire peoples. In one of these texts, there is a phrase that chills: "They will build temples in my name, but I will not be inside them." What does this mean if not a direct criticism of the institutionalization of faith? When transforming the spiritual message into doctrine, and doctrine into political power, what remains of the essence of all that was taught? These forbidden manuscripts reveal the hidden side of the history of Christianity. They reveal a scenario where faith was manipulated, where the truth was shaped according to the interests of those in power. And the Vatican, with all its secret archives and its resistance to allowing full access to the documents it keeps, is a central player in this shadow play. Researchers who have managed to gain access to parts of the Vatican archive report the existence of entire sessions dedicated to apocryphal documents. These are underground rooms with controlled temperature and humidity, where gospels, letters, notes, and lost translations are found. Some of these records are classified with codes that prevent even knowing their contents without papal authorization. Why so much secrecy? Why can't the whole world have access to texts that tell the story of Jesus? Why allow only a select few the privilege of deciding what is and is not legitimate when it comes to spirituality and salvation? The answer is always the same: maintain control. Because if people know that there are other ways of connecting with the divine, which do not go through intermediaries, which do not depend on institutions or sacraments, the entire system collapses. And this is what scares the most: those who have always used religion as an instrument of domination. This is the reason why these texts were persecuted, burned, hidden. And that is also the reason why we are here, talking about them, rescuing every fragment, every name, every truth that they tried to bury. The resistance is enormous. Many videos on these topics are demonetized, deleted, or have their reach reduced. Websites hosting translations of these gospels are taken down. Pages are reported, but still, the truth escapes. Because the truth cannot be imprisoned forever. And as more people awaken, more people begin to look for answers beyond the obvious, beyond what is permitted, beyond what is stamped on the altars. If this content touched you, if you feel that something powerful is being revealed, write the phrase in the comments: "Free the manuscripts," or "I want to see the hidden truth." It shows that you are here with me, on this journey for light, for revelation, for history that has been buried but not forgotten. And if you feel it in your heart, also leave your prayer request. We are creating a chain of people who are not afraid to know, who are not afraid to think, who do not bow down to imposed silence. And the next revelation we're going to bring could be even more impactful than everything that's been shown so far. The Vatican never recognized this gospel as authentic, but it also never explained why. And it is exactly this silence that is most disturbing and, at the same time, arouses even more distrust. Because when it comes to something as serious, as potentially transformative as a document that contradicts the official version of Jesus' death, the least one would expect would be a clear, documented, theologically grounded justification. But what we find over the centuries is the opposite of this, a systematically evasive, if not completely denialist, stance. The Vatican prefers silence to transparency, oblivion to investigation, concealment to revelation. No official note, no papal pronouncement, no doctrinal publication directly proposed to refute the details of this forbidden gospel that states that Jesus was not crucified. Not even the great conciliar documents risk touching on this topic in depth. Everything is treated as a heresy so old and discredited that it does not deserve a response. But if it doesn't deserve a response, why the continued effort to keep this text out of circulation? Why prohibit its disclosure? Why deny access to copies preserved within the Vatican's secret archives? It is important to understand that the Church, especially after the strengthening of Catholicism as the official religion of the Roman Empire, developed highly effective mechanisms of narrative control. And within this logic, what cannot be fought with arguments is silenced with authority. And this includes documents, books, records, and gospels that do not fit into the theological vision constructed and imposed over centuries. The Gospel of Barnabas, for example, which is one of the texts that directly mentions that Jesus was not crucified, is simply ignored by most Catholic leaders, and the few who dare to mention him in public are immediately discredited, as if his mere mention were reason enough to invalidate his ministry. But the curious thing is that, even with all this resistance, copies of this gospel survived. They are kept in private libraries, in Orthodox monasteries, in collections of independent scholars who risked their careers to preserve what they consider to be a truth that needs to be brought to light. And this text is not alone. It is part of a much broader set of apocryphal gospels, Gnostic gospels, hermetic texts, and secret manuscripts that have been erased from official history, but continue to echo through the generations like an uncomfortable whisper that insists on saying, "Not everything they told you is true." When we analyze the few indirect references that the Vatican makes to these texts, what we find are circular arguments. They say that these gospels are unreliable because they are not part of the canon. But the canon itself was defined by a religious elite who selectively decided which texts would be accepted and which would be condemned. So how can we trust a process that has never been transparent and that to this day remains shrouded in secrets, political pressures, and interests that go far beyond faith? If there were intellectual honesty, the Church would open its archives and allow scholars from all over the world, from different faiths and areas of knowledge, to have free access to these documents. But that doesn't happen, and that, in itself, says a lot. The fact that the Vatican has never bothered to explain why it rejects this gospel based on objective criteria is powerful evidence that perhaps this truth is more uncomfortable than they are willing to admit. Because recognizing the possibility that Jesus was not crucified compromises not only the narrative of the Passion, but the entire sacrificial logic that supports the dogmas of redemption, salvation through blood, original sin, baptism as spiritual cleansing, communion as a memorial of the broken body. It's a chain reaction. And perhaps that is precisely why silence is preferred, because when talking about the text, even if it were to try to refute it, the Church would need to give it visibility, and giving visibility to this type of revelation is opening holes in the wall of the official narrative. What many don't know is that, behind the scenes at the Vatican, there are records of secret meetings where topics like this are discussed confidentially. Internal documents already leaked by ecclesiastical officials reveal that the gospel that affirms the non-crucifixion of Jesus is known, is studied, is considered within the walls of the Roman Curia, but will never be publicly assumed, because that would compromise centuries of religious authority. It is easier to keep people in ignorance than to have to deal with the consequences of a liberating truth. And this truth, sooner or later, will emerge. It is already emerging, because the very resistance to explaining it fuels distrust and invites more and more people to research it on their own. Today, with the internet, with access to digital libraries, with files being revealed little by independent researchers and former members of the church who broke with the system, there is no longer any way to contain this flow. And if the Vatican continues without responding, without taking a position, without explaining why it rejects a gospel with such historical and spiritual relevance, it is up to us to investigate. It's up to us to connect the pieces. It is up to us to raise the questions that many are still afraid to ask. What if everything we've been taught about the crucifixion isn't true? How would this change your view of Jesus? This question alone is capable of shaking the foundations of faith for millions of people around the world. It touches directly on the heart of a narrative repeated for centuries, defended tooth and nail by religious institutions, and taught as absolute truth since the first steps of official Christianity. Questioning the crucifixion is, for many, sacrilege. But for those who are seeking truth beyond dogma, beyond the walls of the Vatican and the rigid liturgies, this question is the beginning of an awakening. Because if the crucifixion of Jesus, as we are told, is a symbolic construction or even a historical manipulation, then everything needs to be reviewed. All. The image of a man hanging on the cross, bleeding, crowned with thorns, has been deeply ingrained in the collective mind of humanity as the pinnacle of sacrifice, as the ultimate expression of divine love. But what the apocryphal Gospels, which have been banned, hidden, and persecuted for centuries, show is that this image may not be a literal account of the facts, but rather a distorted representation of an event that never happened in the way it was recorded in the canonical Gospels. The alternative text we analyzed here, hidden in secret libraries, stored in forgotten monastery vaults, and kept out of the public eye by the Vatican, suggests something completely different, that Jesus was taken to heaven before suffering, and that someone else, probably Judas, was crucified in his place. And this report does not appear in isolation. It is repeated in different fragments found over the centuries, in different languages, in different forms, but with the same core. The crucifixion was a mistake, perceived as truth, a spiritual theater, an orchestrated illusion, or even a replacement planned, for spiritual reasons much deeper than we can understand. And the big question that remains is, why? Why change history? Why hide the possibility that Jesus did not die as taught? What do you gain from this? The Vatican to this day does not respond. He never explained clearly and objectively why he rejects these Gospels. He never offered an open analysis of whether the alternative accounts had any basis. The silence, in this case, is deafening, and when an institution that claims to be the guardian of the truth avoids a topic, what is it really guarding? Because silence is also a form of control. And when this silence is accompanied by censure, fear, and persecution of those who dare to think differently, then we are no longer talking about faith. We are talking about domination, of manipulation, from a structure that feeds on ignorance and fears knowledge. The possibility that Jesus did not die on the cross but was spared would completely transform our understanding of who he was and what he came to teach. It would mean that his mission was not to suffer to pay for our sins, but rather to awaken us to a greater truth, which does not depend on suffering, blood, or guilt, a truth that is within us, which it always was. The sacrifice would be symbolic, the message spiritual, and liberation interior. Imagine the impact of this for millions of believers who base their faith on an idea of pain, on a God who requires blood to forgive. What would happen to church structures? With liturgical practices? With the religious economy based on penances, confessions, indulgences, sacraments? The world would see a shock of gigantic proportions. And perhaps that is precisely why this topic continues to be avoided. Because he has the power to free. And when people free themselves, they no longer accept being manipulated. They no longer kneel before idols created for convenience. They seek the sacred in themselves and not in luxurious altars or pulpit speeches. They return to what is essential. And Jesus, as presented in these hidden texts, wanted exactly that, for people to wake up, that they would not depend on men to get closer to God, that they didn't need empty rituals to feel the divine, that they understood that the kingdom of heaven is within each one, and that salvation is a state of consciousness, not a future reward. If the crucifixion was an act, if Jesus' physical death never happened the way it was told, then the resurrection also takes on another meaning. Perhaps Jesus reappeared to the disciples not as a dead man who came back to life, but as someone who never died, as a master who continued his mission, now in a more subtle, more spiritual way. This would completely change Christian theology, and it would explain why the Vatican is so insistent on keeping certain documents under secrecy, away from the public eye, locked away in the depths of its secret archives. This is where the importance of manuscripts found in caves, in remote monasteries, in forgotten archives comes in. They show that there was resistance, that there were currents of thought within Christianity itself that saw Jesus differently, who spoke of an illusory crucifixion, of a Savior who never needed to die. These texts speak of liberation, of enlightenment, of direct connection with God. They speak of a living faith, unmediated, uninstitutionalized. And these are texts that the Vatican has never been interested in publishing. Now that you've heard all this, that you've delved into this revelation with me, I want to invite you to speak out, right here in the comments. My faith seeks the truth. If this content touched you, or comment, the truth about Jesus needs to be revealed to further strengthen this current of awakening. And if you want, also leave your prayer request. It doesn't matter if you are Catholic, evangelical, spiritualist, or just someone searching. We are on this journey together, and what we explore next may be even more revealing. Do you believe this text should be revealed to the world? Comment below. Let's discuss. This simple question has more power than it seems, because it goes beyond mere intellectual curiosity or theological provocation. It touches on something much deeper, the right that every human being has to know the truth, especially when that truth has been systematically hidden by institutions that claim to be guardians of the faith. The text we are analyzing, and which many call forbidden gospel, it's not just an old manuscript. He is a fragment of a hidden story, an important piece of a puzzle that has been dismantled, edited, resignified, and controlled over the centuries to support a unique, convenient, and functional version of the figure of Jesus. This gospel, which states that Jesus did not die on the cross, but was replaced by Judas or another man, is like a mirror placed in front of official history, reflecting everything that they did not want us to see. And the burning question is, why isn't this text in our Bibles? Why isn't it discussed in our churches? Why do so many priests, pastors, and theologians avoid even mentioning it? The answer is simple and at the same time frightening, because this text breaks with the narrative of pain, suffering, guilt, and fear. He presents a version where the divine plan does not depend on blood, but on conscience, where redemption does not come from martyrdom, but from wisdom, where Jesus is seen not as a sacrificial lamb, but as an enlightened master who came to awaken and not to die. If this information were widely available, millions of people would ask themselves, why was I taught to worship a cross? Why was I told that Jesus' death was necessary? Why was my faith built on the idea of a bloody sacrifice, when there was another version that spoke of spiritual liberation and not condemnation? The revelation of this forbidden gospel would not only call into question the entire doctrinal structure of the church, but would also cause a true emotional and spiritual earthquake in millions of believers. But is this bad? Or is this shakeup just what humanity needs to rediscover the true spiritual path? The hiding of this text is not an innocent mistake. It is an ancient strategy of domination. The church, throughout history, has not just hidden texts like this. It has persecuted, excommunicated, burned, and murdered those who dared to bring them to light. During the Inquisition, anyone who spoke of a Jesus other than the Jesus on the cross was automatically labeled a heretic. Centuries of oppression have created a system where fear has become a powerful tool to control thought, faith, and even the search for God itself. But times are changing. Technology, freedom of information, and the courage of independent scholars are beginning to break down these walls. Today, more than ever, it is possible to access manuscripts that were locked in safes. It is possible to hear voices that were previously silent. And it is possible to ask questions that would previously have been considered blasphemy. And that's why this discussion needs to happen. Because as long as this text remains hidden, as long as it is treated as taboo, as long as people are afraid to question it, the truth will continue to be buried beneath the rubble of official history. And there is nothing more dangerous than a buried truth, because it always finds a way to resurface, to shake the structures, to illuminate consciences. Revealing this gospel is not only an act of justice with the historical figure of Jesus, but also with each believer who, in good faith, built their spirituality on pillars that perhaps are not as solid as they seemed. It is an act of liberation, and also responsibility, because the truth, when it arrives, does not ask for permission, but requires maturity to be faced. When we look at this text with honest eyes, free from doctrine, we are able to realize something that perhaps has always been before us, that Jesus did not come into the world to die for us, but to live among us, that he did not come to be worshipped, but to be understood, that his mission was not sacrificial, but revelatory, and that perhaps the greatest miracle was not the resurrection of a body, but the awakening of a conscience. Imagine the impact of all this being revealed to the general public. Imagine what the reaction of large religious institutions would be like. Imagine how many would resist, deny. But also imagine how many would free themselves, be moved, rediscover themselves with a spirituality that is more authentic, more alive, more connected with what really matters: love, light, inner truth. And that's why this question needs to be asked out loud. Do you believe this text should be revealed to the world? Not as curiosity, but as a tool for spiritual transformation, as a beacon for those who are lost among dogmas, traditions, and fears, as an invitation to a new way of seeing Jesus, not for what we were told, but for who he really was. If this revelation shocked you, wait until you see the manuscript that claims Jesus had descendants. Yes, exactly that. An ancient document, suppressed over the centuries, carefully removed from official history, and hidden in the Vatican's secret archives, brings a revelation that may be even more shocking than anything that has been said so far. Jesus didn't just survive the crucifixion, as well as had a bloodline, a family, children, real flesh and blood descendants, who, according to some historical sources, may have continued their message silently and protected by the shadows of history. This manuscript, which many scholars call Gospel of the Sacred Lineage, was mentioned in a veiled way in several other apocryphal texts. But only recently clearer fragments began to come to light. According to these records, hidden for centuries in isolated monasteries and private libraries in France, Ethiopia, and the Caucasus region, Jesus would have joined Mary Magdalene, not as a submissive disciple, but as an equal, as a companion. And from this union, a protected generation would have been born, a sacred family tree whose existence was deliberately erased by the great councils of the Church. Think for a moment what that would mean. If Jesus had descendants, then the idea that he was just the Son of God, celibate, separated from the common life of men, falls to the ground. This does not deny your spirituality, but humanizes your mission, reveals another side, more intimate, deeper, more accessible to all of us. A mission that does not end on the cross, but is perpetuated in blood, in the continuity of life. Now imagine how this revelation would affect centuries of doctrine that constructed the image of a solitary, sacrificed Christ, isolated from any earthly ties. Imagine the impact of millions of believers upon learning that the history they were taught may have been rewritten to hide a living lineage, a direct inheritance that was wiped from collective memory by the very institution that claimed to preserve the truth. The burning question is, why hide this? Why such concern in suppressing any indication that Jesus could have fathered children? Because a human lineage represents continuity, power, legitimacy, and at a time when the Church sought to centralize all spiritual and political power in its hands, the simple idea that living descendants of Jesus could exist outside of its control was seen as a threat. It is no coincidence that every mention of this topic was treated with violence. Books burned, manuscripts banned, secret orders persecuted. Even stories linking the Knights Templar to this secret were suppressed. because according to some theories, they had found evidence of this lineage during their expeditions in the Holy Land. And if you think this sounds like fiction, maybe that's because that's exactly how they wanted it to sound. But the documents exist. Fragments have been translated by independent scholars. Some medieval texts hide clues in codes, symbols, and disguised genealogies. Ancient churches in Europe feature enigmatic representations that show Mary Magdalene with a child in her arms, and not just any child. It is a figure surrounded by a divine aura, suggesting that this child was much more than he thought. The Vatican itself, in its oldest works, hides this narrative under layers of metaphors, removing it from the reach of ordinary believers. But the truth has a force that no censorship can contain forever. If you've stayed with me this far, it's because you feel, like me, that there is something much bigger behind the story we were told. And that's exactly why I need you on this journey. If you are not yet registered, click the sign up button now and activate the bell. This way, you will be one of the first to receive the next episode, which will bring one of the most impactful revelations of all. In the next video, we will talk about the lost document that claims Jesus had children and was hidden by the church. Yes, that's right, a forgotten manuscript, rejected by councils and silenced over the centuries, but which carries a truth that can shake the foundations of faith as we know it. You won't want to miss this. And if you've come this far with me, it's proof that you're ready to continue. Comment below, "I want to see the lost document." This phrase shows that you are part of those who are awakening, those who want more, those who are not afraid of the truth. Don't forget to leave the like too. This is what shows YouTube that this content needs to be delivered to more people. Every like and every comment helps spread this revelation. So get ready, because what's coming will be even harder to ignore. See you in the next episode.